Thank you for joining the Creation Theology Fellowship in our Days of Creation puppet show. This video will give the theological background of the Days of Creation so that as we do our puppet shows, we can also learn about God and his work of creating. Now, we know from Scripture, from the first chapter of Genesis, that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. This story is often called the Hexameron, from the Greek hexa, meaning 6, and meron, meaning day. You say that with me? Hexameron. Hexa, 6, and meron, day. Now you're going to be using puppets to represent the events of the 6 days, while a narrator reads the biblical story in the background. This video will mostly focus on the theology, but if you want to learn more about the puppet show contest itself, more information can be found at creationtheologyfellowship.org/puppets. St. Thomas Aquinas, who is a doctor of the church, teaches us that God didn't just do things in a random order, but he did things in a specific order, that the first 3 days are days of forming, and the second 3 days are days of filling. So when God first creates the world, we hear that the earth is dark, formless, and empty. And so God has to create light to fill the world. Then he has to form the world into the right order, and then fill it with things so it's not empty. So on the first day, God creates light. And then he parallels that on the 4th day by creating the sun, moon, and stars, which produce light. On the 2nd day, he creates the firmament to divide the waters. And on the 5th day, he puts birds and fish in the firmament in the waters to fill them. On the 3rd day, God creates the dry land and brings plants on it. And then on the 6th day, he brings land animals and humans to fill the land. And then finally, on the 7th day, God will rest and bless everything that he has created. There are 2 parts to the first day of creation. First, God creates heaven and earth. Heaven is created already mature. And by heaven here, we don't mean the visible heavens as in the sky and outer space, but rather we mean heaven as in God's throne room, where God dwells with the angels and the saints. So many saints thought that this first day is likely also when the angels were created. The earth, on the other hand, is created dark, formless, and empty. And so God begins to solve this on the first day by creating light. And then he separates light from darkness. If we notice, God does not specifically create darkness. Darkness is simply the absence of light. Right? Whenever we experience evil, it is really just the absence of God. So just like darkness is the absence of light. And God separates these and calls them day and night, so we can begin to have a pattern of time for the rest of the 6 days. On the 2nd day, God creates the firmament. Now, there's a lot of confusion on what the firmament is. Right? It's a big word that we don't use nowadays. For the ancient Hebrews who wrote this text, they would have looked up into the sky, right? And what did they see? It looked like the sky was this great ocean above, and there must have been something holding it up. And then there's water below them when they look down to the sea. And so we can think of the firmament now as something like the sky in outer space. It divides where God dwells from where we dwell. After the 2nd day, we could now imagine that there's this big clump of water in the firmament. And so God, on the 3rd day, takes this water, and we hear the water goes down to reveal dry land. And then on this land, God brings up plants. And he specifically mentions 2 types of plants, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees. Right? We can think of this as wheat and grapes, which are used to make the Eucharist. So even though God probably made all sorts of plants on day 3, the ones the text draws our attention to, is specifically the ones which we use to create the bread and wine of the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is the summit of our spiritual life. On the fourth day, we've now moved from the days of forming to the days of filling. God has made the whole world, and now he wants the world to be inhabited by things. And so in the sky, he is going to put the sun, moon, and stars. And the sun, moon, and stars are meant to mark time. Every day, the sun appears to rise and set. And the cycles of the moon originally marked the months. And then the movement of the stars in heaven, as you get different stars in different times of the year, and this would mark the cycle of a year. So before clocks existed, the sun, moon, and stars were extremely important of how people knew what time it was in the day, in the week, in the month, and in the year. On the fifth day, we see God creates the swarming things. He creates fish to swarm in the sea and birds to swarm in the air. And we birds flying. It's not as though the birds that are at the back of the flock of birds are following the birds at the front, but rather they all naturally move together. That's the way God created them. And we see the same thing with the school of fish. They naturally all swim together. These sorts of creatures move in ways that are very different from us, and they live in a very different world from us, either in the sea or the air. And they can show us other sorts of ways in which God created animals to live. On the sixth day, God created land animals and humans. When he creates land animals, we hear about three different kinds of land animals that he creates. There are cattle, there are wild beasts, and there are things that creep on the ground. So we have some animals that are meant to live with us, that we domesticate, and God created for us to take care of, and for them to provide for us. There are other animals God created that are wild animals that sometimes we need to stay away from, as they can be dangerous, but show attributes of God in other ways. And there are also creeping things, things that move along the ground and under the ground all around us. And it's very important that we have all these different kinds of animals. They all play different important roles in the ecosystem, and God intended it to be that way. When God creates man and woman, right, he creates man singular as man and woman. And when God creates man and woman, he says, "Let us create," reminding us of the Trinity, how God is multiple persons, just like we as a human family are multiple persons. And we are meant to live in perfect harmony with one another, just like the Father, Son, and Spirit are in perfect unity with one another. Man is also given dominion over the creation. And this dominion is not to exploit the creation. Pope Francis has reminded us of this quite a bit in his pontificate, that because of the fall, it's easy for us to abuse our dominion over the creation. We're meant to take care of the creation, and the creation is meant to be a gift to us. But we can't abuse it and misuse it in sinful ways. We have to live in proper harmony with it. Finally, on the seventh day of creation, God rests. And a lot of people are very confused when they read this. They'll think, isn't God all-powerful? Why would an all-powerful being need to rest? It's not that God rested in the sense that he got tired and ran out of energy. God could do anything. Rather, God rests because he wants to dwell with us. He had made the whole creation, and he had crowned creation with the greatest of his creations, mankind. And now he wants to live with mankind. And so it's not only that he rests, but rather he hallows the creation. He blesses the whole creation, because now it has reached its completion. And now it is the work of humans to work with God, to continue to develop the work of creation. And we are called to be creative in our own work. And even with this puppet show, you want to show your creativity and mimic what God has done in creating. But thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something about the creation story in Genesis. And please be creative in your story, that our God is a creative God. And we are made in the image of a creative God. So we can show forth our creativity in following after the pattern God did. We can look around at the creation, see all sorts of beautiful different types of animals and plants and stars and all sorts of great things God made, and learn from his creativity. If you'd like to learn more about this puppet show, more information can be found at creationtheologyfellowship.org/puppets. And if you have any questions, you can contact Dr. Jennifer Bryson, who is the head of this puppet show project. And you can contact her at jennifersbryson@gmail.com. There's also a link to her contact information on the Creation Theology Fellowship. The deadline for puppet show submissions is August 1st. And there is a prize, which you can find on the website. So we really look forward to seeing your submissions.